So this video will be, in many ways, the flip side to the previous one, but in another sense, it's a counterpart to it, because weakening an argument is, well, it's the other side of the coin to strengthening an argument. So here's an example of what one of these questions looks like. So it won't always ask specifically about weakening an argument. It might ask about what undermines or challenges the argument. But again, we're going to have a paragraph, a question like this. And so what is our approach to these questions? Well, first of all, we want to know what we're looking for in terms of correct and incorrect answers. So a correct answer to one of these weakening an argument questions will typically undermine an assumption that the argument takes for granted. So again, if the argument takes some assumption for granted, and then we have something that says, that assumption isn't valid after all, that would weaken the argument. Something to keep in mind is that the correct answer doesn't need to refute or disprove the argument. It just needs to weaken it to make it less likely to be correct. Now, an incorrect answer will do one of two things. It will either strengthen the argument as opposed to weakening it, or it will do neither. It won't strengthen or weaken it. It'll just be irrelevant. So we're seeing here a close correspondence between the weakening an argument questions and the strengthening an argument questions. And again, we want to keep in mind the actual conclusion, the specific point that's being made, because incorrect answers will often play on the potential for test takers to get a little careless and for lose sight of the actual point being made. So our process for these questions, very similar to the strengthening an argument questions. When I read the passage and identify the conclusion, then use the conclusion to work backward and identify the premise and counter-premise, premises and counter-premises, as the case may be. Then, again, want to identify at least one assumption that the argument takes for granted, and this will give you a head start on your approximate answer. Then we want to reread the conclusion to make sure we grasp what the specific point is that's being made. Go through the answer choices, eliminate any that are clearly wrong in the sense that they either strengthen the argument or seem to be clearly irrelevant. And then perhaps there will be just one answer choice that matches your approximate answer, or you might have to go back and do a little process of elimination to get rid of remaining answer choices. So even after numerous products made with artificial sweeteners became available, sugar consumption per capita, per person, continued to rise. Now manufacturers are introducing fat-free versions of various foods that they claim have the taste and texture of the traditional high-fat versions. Even if the manufacturer's claim is true, given that the availability of sugar-free foods did not reduce sugar consumption, it is unlikely that the availability of these fat-free foods will reduce fat consumption. And again, they're asking us which of these most seriously undermines the argument. We want to identify our conclusion to begin with. That conclusion is that regardless of what the manufacturers claim and whether or not that's true, it's unlikely that the availability of these fat-free foods will reduce fat consumption. Now, the previous sentence is a counter-premise because that goes against the conclusion that these fat-free foods will reduce fat consumption, and we see a little bit of a signal here, even if that claim is true. That's saying, regardless of that. That's how we can identify a counter-premise. I know we didn't see a counter-premise in the strengthening an argument video, but that's a good example of saying, again, regardless of whether or not this is true, here's the point that we're arguing for. And then the first sentence is going to be a premise. Even after numerous products made with artificial sweeteners became available, sugar consumption per capita continued to rise. Now, is this really a premise? Well, it is. It would support the argument provided that a certain assumption holds true. And what is that assumption? Well, that assumption is the idea that what's true for sugar and sugar substitutes is also true for fat and fat substitutes. In other words, this argument depends on or assumes an analogy between what's true in the sugar arena and what is true in the fat arena. Arena meaning the area. Sugar, sugar substitutes, fat, fat substitutes. That what's true in this area is also going to hold true there. And that's an assumption because we don't have any evidence that that is true. If it were indeed true, then this premise would give pretty good support for this conclusion. If it's not true, or if we can show that that's not true, or we can at least question the basis of that assumption, then we can weaken the argument. So let's look at the answer choices. A. Several kinds of fat substitute are available to manufacturers, each of which gives a noticeably different taste and texture to products that contain it. Well, that has to do with the counter premise. And remember, the conclusion is saying, regardless of what's true about taste and texture, it's unlikely that these fat-free foods will reduce fat consumption, because this conclusion is based on this analogy between sugar-free foods and fat-free foods. So that is not correct. The products made with artificial sweeteners did not taste like products made with sugar. Well, let's think about that. The analogy here is that what's true of sugar and sugar-free food holds true for fat and fat-free food. Well, the counter premise does note that these fat-free versions have the same taste as the traditional high-fat versions. So if the products made with artificial sweeteners did not taste like products made with sugar, that actually would connect to this assumption that we identified. But let's check the other choices just to be sure. The foods brought out in sugar-free versions did not generally have reduced levels of fat. So that's mixing up different points about sugar and fat, and that's all convoluted, and we can cross that one out. D, people who regularly consume products containing artificial sweeteners are more likely than others to consume fat-free foods. Again, that's just kind of mixing things up that don't really get at the actual conclusion being made. And then E, not all foods containing fat can be produced in fat-free versions. Well, it might seem convincing, but let's think about this. This conclusion is focused on the fat-free foods that are available. We're not worrying about the ones that aren't available. So that brings us back to this. Again, this analogy that's assumed in the structure of the argument. So we've called that assumption into question, and in doing so, we've undermined the argument, and that's going to be our correct answer. So let's look at a second example. Last year, Mayor Stevens established a special law enforcement task force with the avowed mission of eradicating corruption in city government. So the avowed mission, the publicly stated mission of eradicating corruption in city government. The mayor's hand-picked task force has now begun prosecuting a dozen city officials. Since all of these officials were appointed by Mayor Bixby, Mayor Stevens' predecessor and longtime political foe, it is clear that those being prosecuted have been targeted because of their political affiliations. Okay, so again, we want to start with our conclusion, and that's going to be this sentence here. Since all of these officials were appointed by Mayor Bixby, Mayor Stevens' predecessor and longtime political foe, it is clear that the ones being prosecuted are being targeted because of their political affiliations, not because of this avowed goal of eradicating corruption in city government. This is a premise. They've begun prosecuting city officials. And this is also a premise in the sense that the task force started with this mission of getting rid of corruption. Now, what about the assumptions? One assumption would be that anybody who was appointed by Mayor Bixby is necessarily a political affiliate or political ally of Mayor Bixby. And that might not necessarily be true. It could be that, let's say, Mayor Bixby appointed someone to serve as transportation secretary because that person knew a lot about transportation regardless of political orientation. Or you can imagine some other government position that Mayor Bixby appointed someone to, not necessarily because of some political affiliation, but just because they needed somebody to do the job and that was the best person they could find. But another assumption is that Stevens is singling out officials appointed by Mayor Bixby. In other words, it does say that all of the officials who are being prosecuted were appointed by Mayor Bixby. Well, we don't know anything about the percentage of officials in the government. In other words, what if all of the officials in the government were appointed by Mayor Bixby? The fact that Mayor Stevens has selected a task force that has begun to prosecute a dozen of them doesn't necessarily imply that this is a politically motivated attack on Mayor Bixby's former appointees, because there could be dozens or, who knows, hundreds of others that were appointed by Mayor Bixby who are not being investigated. Again, the assumption, the key assumption or the approximate answer that can come from our assumptions would be the idea that Stevens is somehow singling out Bixby's appointees. So let's look at the choices. A, complaints of official corruption in city government have decreased. Well, that might be a nice thing, but that doesn't address the question of whether they've been targeted because of their political affiliation. B, former Mayor Bixby did not publicly oppose Mayor Stevens' establishment of the anti-corruption task force. That's one of those that could seem tempting, and we'll come back to it and look more closely at why that might not be correct. C, almost all of the officials who served in city government for any length of time are appointees of Mayor Bixby. Right, that's going to be the correct answer because that meshes with or goes along with this idea that the argument is implying that Stevens is somehow singling out Bixby's appointees. But if nearly all the officials who have been in government for any length of time are appointed by Mayor Bixby, then that certainly weakens this argument that he's been singling them out. The other two choices, all the members of the anti-corruption task force had other jobs. That's not relevant. And then E, during the last mayoral election campaign, then Mayor Bixby hotly disputed the current mayor's claim that there was widespread corruption. Again, that's not particularly relevant because we only want to focus on the specific argument being made, namely that Mayor Stevens and his task force are singling out appointees of Mayor Bixby for prosecution. So why is B not correct? Well, it doesn't directly address or have to do with this argument. If we think about it, whether or not Bixby opposed the establishment of the anti-corruption task force or not, whether he did so publicly, privately, both, neither, it doesn't connect with the key point being made in the argument, and that is the idea of whether or not the ones who have been prosecuted were prosecuted because of their political affiliations, regardless of what Bixby thinks about it. Okay, so again, this is the correct answer because it weakens an assumption that the argument depends on. So if you can knock down or weaken an assumption that the argument depends on, you weaken the argument itself.